Welcome to a dialogue on accountability in the digital age, a dialogue with representatives of a global, multi-stakeholder community.
And I'm your host, Frits Bussemaker, and today I'm delighted and privileged to have a conversation with Jacques Kruse-Brandao. Jacques, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Allow me to introduce Jacques. You are the global head of advocacy cybersecurity services at SGS in Germany, a member of the board of directors of the European Cybersecurity Organization. You're also part of the Alliance of IoT Innovation, where you are the core lead of standardization in cybersecurity, member of Charter of Trust, and you have well over 25 years experience in ICT around cyber, drones, digital identity, with companies like NXP, but also with the European Commission and more. So, Jacques, a very solid, strong background indeed. And the main topic today is we're going to talk about the cyber physical ecosystems and what we need to organize. Again, Jacques, thank you and welcome to the program. Now, for today's talk, I just summed up just a very brief overview of your vast background. From what perspective will you be having a conversation today?
Well, the idea was to talk about the risk classification of IoT devices. The idea came up when we discussed whether there is guidance available from a manufacturer to classify IoT devices which they develop. So, for example, appliances or routers or smart home detectors, smart smoke detectors in your home or in the nuclear facility. It's a similar device, but you need to think about what kind of cybersecurity functionalities need to be implemented in the design process into a device based on a risk-based approach, because everybody's talking about a risk-based approach these days whenever it's about new legislation or requirements, and of course this is correct and need to be taken into account, but how to do a risk classification, right?
Okay,
so
that's a great question, and that's what we're going to have a discussion about. But it seems like that is based from the Alliance of IoT Innovation. Am I correct?
You're completely correct. That was the idea why IoT, why the AOTI, the Alliance of IoT Innovation, because there are so many members in that association who are manufacturer, who are operator of devices, who develop devices as a third party to manufacturers. So there's the complete ecosystem in place which contributed to this approach. Proposal, right? And which everybody can make use of, at least as a starting point, and also towards policymakers to, let's say, think about where to start when it's about standardization requests, because this is not available today. So we started to ask the question, where is there a standard which we can make use of, or which the manufacturer or the operator can make use of? But there wasn't. So we started really from scratch, and we thought about, okay, what do you need to think about if you start developing a device? And we finally found out that it is also important to also do this kind of lesson from an operator approach. Because as an operator, you are in a position that you know where this device will be operated, while the manufacturer is usually not in the possession, or he has not the capability to know where the device will be operated later on. So you need both sides, and so we trying to take both views into account, and finally get to that mapping tool which everybody can make use of.
Great. So this sounds like an industry-led, or at least a multi-stakeholder-led initiative.
Absolutely, absolutely. And also AIoTI, the Alliance of IoT Innovation, has several working groups from different segments. So they really look into manufacturing, into water, into mobility. So various domains are covered, and we asked all these domains to participate the discussion around that risk spectra tool. And we received lots of comments and contributions, and to get finally to a final proposal, I would say, which can maybe used for a starting point for a standardization request.
I got that. Now, you already alluded in the beginning to a couple of examples of what type of advices we're talking about. Maybe you can give me some more examples in the audience of what we should be thinking of.
So what we should think of, basically we started with different spectra, risk spectra, meaning the idea was so what is influencing the risk of a device in general. And we started with the connectivity of a device. So think about a router, or let's say, let's start with a sensor. Maybe a sensor is in a smart home is only connected to your router, and it might be connected to one connectivity solution, which is possibly Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, Zigbee, Z-Wave. And in AIoTI, some years ago, we counted more than 320 different communication or kind of connectivities.
Okay.
API. So of course, maybe there are not so many used nowadays in the smart home, and we may reduce that amount of different types of connectivity to the ones I mentioned. But you need to take each and every into account, because each and every has a different implementation in your device. So this is a starting point. So if there is only one API, one kind of connectivity in your device, maybe Bluetooth, then you need to secure this kind of communication, meaning Bluetooth, secure Bluetooth. And it's available. There's a solution available which makes use of secure elements. So it's stored where credentials are stored securely, where you can initiate a secure, let's say, onboarding process into your network, where you can establish secure communication channels, where you can establish secure software updates and firmware updates until end of life of a device. So this is a starting point, right? Just the connectivity. But at the same time, you may look at the hardware of the device. So whether there are some physical connectors in that device which might be used by an attacker. If the attacker gets such a device into his hands because he buys it in a shop or at eBay or wherever, then he's able to destruct the device and look into it very carefully and very deep into the device, and he would maybe be able to realize where the weak points are of that device. So you need to look into each of those physical connectors, for example, individually, and then decide how to what kind of risk is behind. And we mapped 3 different risk levels, just 3. Otherwise, it's getting too complicated. Okay. So risk level 1, 2, or 3, and then you decide whether this is can be mapped the risk to risk level 1, 2, or 3. Very simple.
So Jacques, you bring me to a point where I need to ask, could you please define what a risk is in this case?
So first of all, a risk is the probability between of an event which happens over time in a certain environment, and of course the probability defines then how to mitigate later on. But you need to look into the cyber circumstances, the cyber physical ones, the physical ones. And you need to do it continuously, or maybe not continuously, but you need to take the dynamic character of today connected IoT devices into account. That means you start with the risk assessment in your development process, or even you need to look at what kind of third-party software or hardware components you make use of in your development process of the IoT device. And then your risk assessment already starts until the end of use of the operation of the device in the field or in the environment where this is operated. Bless you.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry. Yeah, no, I follow. I'm following you. So it's not. So risk is dynamic. It depends on the context. And then can I also translate that the same route you mentioned earlier? I can use that for my home. Then the risk is lower than if I'm going to use it for within a mission critical environment. Then exactly the same system is going to be applied in a different risk environment.
Exactly. But as the manufacturer is responsible for the technical capabilities of the device, he needs to take all these risks into account, right? Maybe he needs to communicate that he implemented certain cybersecurity features into the device based on a certain risk assessment. And then you need to communicate that risk assessment to the user. And then the user can decide whether to make use of that device in his environment, or he need to select another one in his particular environment, which contains probably the cybersecurity features to mitigate the higher risks.
Okay, so can I imagine that somewhere, I mean, now in a shop as a consumer, I could buy a router, again, that example, and say, I just read, oh, this has this particular risk classification. So I know by buying this, I should use it for this situation, but I should not be using it for that situation because it's not been designed for that.
I would say yes, but unfortunately, the cybersecurity maturity level of end users in the consumer market is not that high, to be honest. That means they are very often.
The same question also applies for a B2B environment. If somebody does something in a professional, you still need to know the same thing.
Exactly. So you need to, first of all, you need to have an informed consumer or customer in front of you to be able to decide on, to make his own risk assessment, and then to be able to differentiate which device maybe maps to his needs and which kind of cybersecurity features he wants implemented in that device based on his particular risk assessment or risk classification. Yeah, I think that's an important point. We see several activities in the field to raise that cybersecurity maturity level of users, either end consumer or business. But unfortunately, we are not there where we would like to be.
Yeah. No. Okay. So, and by the way, is that also a part of your own charter? So it's not just providing the mapping. I can also imagine that once you have the mapping, you can advise manufacturers to say, well, look, if that's the type of device you want to bring to the market, I would recommend to use that technology, but not that technology, given the difference in risk that technology offers.
Of course, and there are plenty of consultants in the field, in the ecosystem, who would be able to do such recommendation. We as SGS are usually more we maybe do a pre-assessment, but finally we are the ones who evaluate the proper implementation of the cybersecurity features in the device. And therefore are not in a position to consult, because we are either or doing, right? So this is important. You need to be an independent, impartial partner of our customers to do the evaluation of a kind of implementation.
Okay.
But yeah, of course, there are plenty of consultants in the field, and I also, let's say, promote ask your hacker. Yeah, because they also need to earn money, and they have the capability to look into the device, and they give you a good report. But of course, this report can also be done by a cybersecurity lab of SGS.
Okay, now I'm going to be very operational. This instrument, this framework you have developed, is that at the end of the day a set of documents, papers you can read on and read what the criteria are you should follow or not? That's basically what it is.
Yes. First of all, it's a paperwork, so
Yeah.
it's a kind of recommendation, a guidance where to start, a guidance on what kind of spectra you need to take into account and what kind of risk categories you need to look at per risk spectra. So if we talk about the risk spectra, then it's as I mentioned, you may start with the connectivity of the device, of the hardware, of the device. But then you go further into functionality. What kind of functionality has the device? What kind of application does the device have? Is it a very simple application, or is it a very complex application which contains higher risks or other kind of risks? You may look into what kind of data is being, let's say, generated, transferred, stored, or processed in the device. Then we are talking about whether this data is personally identifiable information. So then it's about the GDPR, about the General Data Protection Regulation, and then we need to talk about data protection. So how is this data protected in the device? Is it encrypted or not? And how is it stored? At what time is it encrypted? By where are the credentials which are used to encrypt such data? And then you probably need to ask, okay, what kind of personal identifiable information is that? Is it an IP address? Is it your birth date, or is it your address, or is it a biometric data like facial data or fingerprint data in the device stored? So then you may need, or this may be mapped to a higher risk than if you have just data which is not related to people or to the user of the device. So it ends up in different risks, right?
Got that. And may I assume that you start off talking about individual devices, but may I assume this framework also covers the complete architecture, so the combination of all the various devices?
So first of all, so we started to look into the IoT-centric approach. So we look really at the device itself. It's a starting point. Of course, this is not enough because you need to put this device into a context. The device only does not work without any application, and there might be an app available in the field which makes use of the device. Think about smart home applications, making use of various kind of sensors, water sensors, air, humidity, lighting, air conditioning, heating. There are hundreds of sensors available in the field which can be adapted to a certain smart home control system from different manufacturers. Probably they have only one in common, which is the communication interface, because they aligned on a certain protocol, and then that's why they can talk to each other. But unfortunately, the cybersecurity requirements have not been discussed between these two parties. And this needs to be taken into account when you look into the system. So I think the Cyber Resilience Act today calls it ancillary services. Ancillary services are services that make use of the device and will be addressed or are supposed to be addressed in the Cyber Resilience Act, for example.
Okay, and that's the Cyber Resilience Act designed by the European Commission in this case.
Exactly. It should. So I think the main approach is to make a bridge between the existing NLF and the CSA, the Cyber Security Act, which with the cybersecurity certification framework, which contains the cybersecurity certification schemes on one hand, and on the other hand, we have the new legislative framework with different directives. For example, the machinery directive or the RED, the radio equipment directive, and so several directives which are in place today already, focusing on the risk related to safety. So they are really looking into safety and did not take cybersecurity into account so far. So that's why there are reviews. There will be a new RAD, a new machinery directive, etc. But they are looking only into very few baseline requirements, while if we look into cybersecurity, attack vectors and threats in this domain, then, or in several domains, then we see a lot of more requirements which we need to take into account depending on the risk on one hand, and we also need to take different assurance levels into account, because all these who does the assessment and who will verify such assessments or such implementations is also critical, because maybe on a low level, on a baseline level, self-declaration of conformity may be sufficient regarding the implemented some cybersecurity features, but on a higher, where the risk is higher, there might be the need for third-party assessments by third-party cyber labs.
Yeah.
Like
even in that situation, I can imagine that you then could get in a situation where the risk might be high enough that you need a third-party assessment, but then the party being assessed might want to reduce the risk, so it leads to self-assessment. So how do you deal with that situation?
That was exactly the starting point in the beginning, because the complete NLF is based on a risk assessment by the manufacturer. Okay. So the manufacturer decides on the risk and and how to mitigate such risks. So today, as we learned, the NLF is looking into safety, and usually those engineers designing an IoT device we're really looking into safety since decades. They really know about safety and how to mitigate risk related to safety. But unfortunately, those colleagues are very often not capable of, or they simply don't know the cybersecurity risks. So they need to ask a third party, which knows the threats in the cybersecurity domain. So coming from the cybersecurity world, to take those risks also into account. And this is often not the case. So finally, this ends up in a risk assessment only to safety. And not, yeah. And I think this is the gap here. And that's why basically we started this this approach, creating a guideline for the manufacturer, for the operator to also take those cybersecurity risks into account and be able to map those to different risk levels. It's not about the mitigation, right? So we're not talking about mitigation, because mitigation could be very different, and you can mitigate risks in a different way with different technologies. Those technologies might change. And so the approach was to really start with a very generic approach that everybody can make use it. It's very simple. It's a very simple tool you can start with easily.
Okay, hey, Jacques, I got 3 more questions for you. First of all, how did the European Commission react? I mean, when you came up with this framework? I mean, open arms, or did you know we're not interested?
Indeed, with open arms, because they understood, okay, this is really missing. There was nobody could answer the question of whether there is an IoT classification or risk assessment which leads to a classification of IoT devices in place. So there wasn't something in place, and that's what they realized. So we invited JRC to the discussion, and JRC was very interested and also contributed with ideas to the tool.
Just to confirm, JRC stands for?
The Joint Research Center of the European Commission.
Great. Okay. Yeah. So that was one question I had for you. Secondly, you've just described basically what this mapping tool is. It's a set of papers with a little guideline. Have you considered, or has the Alliance considered different instruments to reach the same objective?
Well, of course, there's always the idea of whether there is something, an alternative available for that. There is the discussion around the I4ADA, about the Radio Equipment Directive, and the and what kind of risk assessment would be or could be used only to the I4ADA, while the I4ADA today is not taking risk into account, but just ask for certain mitigations. So if you, and this need to be evaluated or can be self-declared on a low level, so it does not take the risk into account. And this is, so it just covers a minimum baseline requirement for connected devices.
Okay.
But there is no alternative available today. That's why we started with this tool.
I got that. Now, who do you see as your audience for this framework, as the users? I mean, you already mentioned policymakers, manufacturers. Are there other groups as well which could make use of this framework?
Very important for me is the procurement departments.
Okay.
Because the procurement departments decide on the, let's say, what will be used in the next years in your network. So if, and that is the user, basically the consumer for his own smart home or let's say smart home environment, for example, just to mention an example. But procurement departments in companies, they are part of the complete supply chain, and this is also something we need to take into account. And I mentioned this in the beginning. In the design process, you need to decide already what kind of components you use in your design process. And this is the hardware components, the software components, and usually the procurement department is deciding later on the functionality. So first of all, the designer gives a proposal, but finally the procurement department decides then on which hardware will be used, huh? And which component in the hardware will be used, which kind of security components in the hardware will be used. And so they also need to have a cybersecurity maturity level, to raise their own cybersecurity maturity level, to be able to do such an informed decision in the procurement process.
Okay. Final two questions. First of all, what's the formal status of the current tool? Version 1.0 or still pilot? Where are we?
I would say it's a kind of 1.0. We are very open to receive feedbacks, comments, concerns, whatever, on that tool. So please make use of it, and we are happy to share later on, maybe on the website, the links to the tool itself, and you can download it there and make use of it. And please, we're very open for feedback, either anonymous or by name. So we are happy to implement those comments into the tool, as we want to learn. IoT is an ecosystem play. And it's the play between the manufacturer, the operator, the policymakers, the users, and it only works if we take all the different opinions into account.
Yeah.
And this starts with the risk assessment and the risk classification of such IoT devices.
Oh, we'll make certain to include the right link in the description of the video. Final question. We're talking in the context of accountability in the digital age. How will this tool help with accountability?
Of course, if you start thinking about risks, you do this with a duty of care principle thinking. So if you want to take care of your consumers, of your users, of your devices, then you need to take those kind of different risks into account. And of course, this also, let's say, demonstrate your accountability for the society, the accountability for your customers. And I can only recommend to communicate your approach. Because if you take those things into account, you can communicate it, and then you are ahead of your competition. And this gives a very good reason to also have a little higher price, for example, for your device than compared to your competition, which probably does other things, but not the right ones when it comes to cybersecurity.
Jacques, I want to thank you so much for sharing the insights on this newly developed tool. So the device-centric IE2 security risk spectrum mapping tool. I think you need an acronym. It's quite a long term, so that's my final feedback. But no, thank you for sharing why that tool is developed, for whom it's developed, and what it could lead to. So no, it will lead to a more accountable world, and the world is moving. World Economic Forum calls it the fourth industrial wave, to a cyber physical world. So we do need to control and manage those technologies out there. Thank
Absolutely.
you for sharing how we're doing that.
Thank you for the possibility to talk with you.